Whispers echo through the frozen forests of North America. Stories of something that moves between the trees on winter nights, something that was once human but became something far worse. The Wendigo, a creature born from starvation, madness, and an unspeakable hunger that can never be satisfied. What you are about to hear are 5 encounters that still defy explanation, events where people came face to face with something that should only exist in nightmares. But here's what most people don't know. These aren't just campfire stories passed down through generations. These are documented cases, investigated incidents, testimonies from people who saw something in those woods that changed them forever. The thing about Wendigo encounters is they all share certain details that appear again and again. Details that witnesses couldn't have known unless they experienced something real. The smell that arrives first, like rotting meat mixed with pine sap, and something else, something ancient and wrong. The way the temperature drops so suddenly, you can see your breath even in summer. The sound it makes, not quite human, not quite animal, but somewhere in between. A rasping breath that seems to come from everywhere at once. Pay attention to these details as we move forward. You'll understand why they matter. Our first encounter takes us deep into the wilderness of northern Minnesota, to a place where the forest grows so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground even at noon. It was January of 1998. And 3 experienced hunters had ventured into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness for what should have been a routine winter hunting trip. Mark Sullivan, Jim Krause, and David Chen had been hunting together for over 15 years. They knew these woods, respected them, understood the dangers of winter camping in sub-zero temperatures. They were prepared for everything nature could throw at them. But what happened on the 3rd night of their trip wasn't something you could prepare for. The men had set up camp near a frozen lake, their tent positioned in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The temperature had dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that every breath crystallized in the air, cold enough that the trees made sharp cracking sounds as the sap froze inside them. Sullivan later told investigators that the first sign something was wrong came around 2 in the morning. He woke suddenly, that instant awareness that something had changed in the environment around him. The fire they'd banked before sleeping should have been glowing with coals. Instead, the clearing was completely dark. Not just dark, the kind of darkness that feels thick, oppressive, like it's pressing against your eyes. That's when he noticed the silence. Anyone who spent time in winter forests knows they're never truly silent. Wind moves through branches, small animals rustle in the underbrush. Ice shifts and cracks on frozen water. But Sullivan heard absolutely nothing. The silence was so complete, it made his ears ring. He reached over to wake Krause, but his hand froze halfway there. Something was standing at the edge of their clearing. He could see it outlined against the slightly lighter darkness of the forest beyond, and the shape was all wrong. It stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. The head was the worst part. Even in the darkness, Sullivan could make out the suggestion of antlers or horns, something that branched upward from a skull-like face. What happened next would haunt all the 3 men for the rest of their lives. The creature moved, and the movement was wrong, in a way that defied description. It didn't walk so much as glide, its limbs moving in a jerky, disjointed rhythm that made Sullivan's stomach turn. And then the smell hit them. Krause woke up gasping. The stench so powerful, it triggered his gag reflex. Chen started awake, immediately reaching for the rifle beside his sleeping bag. The thing stopped moving. For what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, it stood there at the edge of their camp. And though they couldn't see its eyes in the darkness, they all felt the weight of its gaze. Sullivan described it later as being studied, examined like a predator, deciding if prey was worth the effort. Then it spoke. That detail is the one that investigators always circle back to, the one that separates this from a simple case of misidentification or animal encounter. The sound that came from the creature wasn't a growl or a roar. It was words, distorted and stretched, but recognizable. It said their names. All 3 of them. Mark, James, David. The voices it used weren't its own. Sullivan recognized the cadence and tone of his dead father. Krause heard his ex-wife's voice, a woman who'd passed away 5 years earlier. Chen heard his childhood best friend, who died in a car accident when they were teenagers. The thing knew them, knew details about their lives it shouldn't have been able to know, and it used that knowledge like a weapon. Chen fired his rifle. The shot was deafening in the frozen silence, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the clearing in harsh white light. In that instant of illumination, they all saw it clearly. The creature's skin was stretched tight over protruding bones, gray and mottled like frostbitten flesh. Its chest was sunken, ribs visible through translucent skin. The face was elongated, jaw distended, filled with teeth that looked more like shards of yellowed bone than proper fangs, but it was the eyes that locked into their memories. Hollow sockets that somehow still contained something that looked back at them, something hungry and aware and infinitely patient. The shot hit center mass. They all saw the impact, saw the creature stagger backward, but there was no blood. No cry of pain. Instead, it tilted its head at an angle no living thing's neck should bend, and it smiled. The expression was a mockery of human emotion, lips pulling back from those terrible teeth in a grin that held no warmth, no humanity. Then it was gone. Not running, not fleeing into the forest. Simply gone, vanished between one heartbeat and the next, as if it had never been there at all. The three men didn't speak. They didn't discuss what to do next. Without a word, they began breaking camp in the darkness, their hands shaking as they stuffed gear into packs with no regard for organization. They left their tent standing, abandoned their carefully prepared food stores, left everything that would slow them down. They hiked through the darkness for 6 hours straight, not stopping, not resting, following their GPS units south toward civilization. None of them looked back. They didn't dare. When they finally reached the ranger station at first light, they were hypothermic, dehydrated, and borderline incoherent. The rangers who found them initially suspected drug use or carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty camping stove, but there was no denying the physical evidence. All three men had lost significant weight overnight, more than should have been possible. Their eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated despite the bright morning sun, and they all had the same marks on their shoulders, long scratches that had frozen over, forming crystalline patterns in their skin that the attending physician couldn't explain. Blood tests showed severe vitamin deficiencies consistent with prolonged starvation, even though they'd only been in the woods for 3 days and had plenty of food. But here's the detail that convinced investigators something genuinely anomalous had occurred. When a recovery team went back to retrieve their abandoned camp, they found the tent exactly where the men described it. The camping gear was undisturbed, food stores intact and untouched by animals, but the clearing itself had changed. Trees surrounding the site, massive pines that had stood for decades, were stripped of bark in long, vertical tiers. The exposed wood beneath showed deep gouges, as if something with immense strength had dragged claws down the trunks. The gouges started at least 10 feet up, far higher than any bear could reach. And in the center of the clearing where Sullivan swore their fire had been, the ground was scorched in a perfect circle, not burned as if from campfire coals. The earth was blackened and crystallized, frozen solid despite being February, and temperatures well below freezing. When they attempted to dig into the scorched area, their tools couldn't penetrate more than an inch. The soil had been fused into something resembling volcanic glass. Most disturbing of all, the recovery team found tracks. They emerged from the tree line on the north side of the clearing, approached to within feet of where the tent stood, then simply stopped, not turned around, not led away. The prints just ended as if whatever made them had lifted off into the air or ceased to exist. The prints themselves matched no known animal. They were roughly humanoid in shape but elongated, the toes spread impossibly wide, each one ending in what appeared to be a thick claw. The stride length between prints measured 7 feet. Whatever made these tracks had legs that would dwarf any human or known animal in the region. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources officially classified the incident as an animal encounter, likely a grizzly bear despite no grizzlies inhabiting that region for over a century. The case was closed, but the lead investigator, a wildlife biologist named Sarah Chen, no relation to David, kept the case file. She'd grown up hearing Ojibwe stories from her grandmother, stories about the Wendigo and what happens when hunger consumes the human soul. 20 years later, she'd encounter 3 more cases with nearly identical details. The scorched earth, the impossible tracks, the witnesses who aged years in a single night. She never stopped believing something was out there in those forests. Our second encounter takes us back further in time to February of 1977, when a forestry surveying team working in the remote regions of northern Saskatchewan stumbled into something that would end careers and break minds. This case gained notoriety not because of what was seen, but because of what was recorded. The team of 6 was conducting routine winter tree surveys, documenting forest health and growth patterns in an area that hadn't been thoroughly surveyed since the 1930s. They carried with them the latest surveying equipment and, critically, a reel-to-reel audio recorder meant to document observations for later transcription. What that recorder captured would eventually be classified by the Canadian government, locked away in archives where it remained until a Freedom of Information Act request pried it loose in 2015. The team's leader was a man named Robert McKenzie, a veteran surveyor with 30 years of experience in harsh wilderness conditions. His team consisted of 5 younger surveyors, fresh graduates from forestry programs, eager to prove themselves in real field conditions. They'd been working in the region for 2 weeks, making good progress despite brutal cold that regularly dropped below -30 degrees. The isolation was extreme. Their base camp was 40 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by helicopter or a 3-day snowmobile trek. They were truly alone out there, cut off from civilization in a way that's almost impossible to achieve in the modern world. The incident occurred on February 14th. Mackenzie's field notes, recovered later, indicate nothing unusual about the day. Clear skies, temperature around -25, good visibility. The team split into 3 pairs to cover more ground, standard procedure for their work. Mackenzie paired with a surveyor named Thomas Walsh, and they headed northeast into a particularly dense section of old-growth forest. The audio recorder was running continuously, a practice Mackenzie insisted on to ensure no observations were lost. For the first 3 hours of the recording, it's exactly what you'd expect. Mackenzie's voice calling out tree measurements, Walsh confirming readings, the crunch of their snowshoes on frozen ground, occasional conversations about the work. Then, at 11:47 in the morning, there's a change in the audio that experts have analyzed repeatedly, never quite able to explain. The ambient sound drops. If you listen carefully to the recording, you can hear it happen. The subtle background noise of wind through trees, the distant calls of winter birds, the creak of branches under snow weight. All of it fades over the course of about 15 seconds until there's nothing but Mackenzie and Walsh's breathing. Walsh notices first. You can hear him say, "You hear that?" Mackenzie responds, "Hear what?" Walsh, clearly unsettled, "Nothing. I don't hear anything. Not even wind." There's a pause. Then Mackenzie says something that would prove prophetic. "Something's wrong. Temperature's dropping." You can hear it in the recording, the way their words start to fog, the vapor in their breath crackling slightly as it crystallizes in increasingly cold air. The change happened too fast to be natural. Within 2 minutes, both men are audibly shivering, their teeth chattering between words. Then the sound begins. It starts low, barely audible beneath their conversation, a kind of keening wail that seems to come from a great distance. Walsh asks, "Is that wind?" but it's not wind, and they both know it. The sound grows closer, louder, resolving into something that resembles human screaming, but wrong in pitch and duration. No human lungs could sustain that sound for as long as it continues, rising and falling in a rhythm that's almost musical, but deeply unsettling. Mackenzie's voice on the recording becomes sharp, authoritative. Back to camp. Now, don't run. Stay together. You can hear them moving faster, their snowshoes crunching more rapidly through the snow. Breathing becoming labored. The screaming sound grows louder, circling them. At one point, Walsh gasps, "Oh God, I see it!" Mackenzie, "Don't look at it. Keep moving." What happens next in the recording has been debated for decades. There's a sound, a wet tearing noise like fabric ripping, followed by Walsh screaming, though his voice sounds distant despite the microphone being clipped to Mackenzie's parka. Mackenzie is shouting Walsh's name, and there's the metallic snick of a rifle being unstrapped. 3 shots ring out, deafening on the recording. The screaming, both Walsh's and the other sound, intensifies. Then there's a heavy impact, something large hitting frozen ground, and Mackenzie is running. You can hear his gasping breaths, the frantic scrape of his snowshoes, the tearing of branches as he crashes through underbrush. This continues for almost 20 minutes. An eternity of desperate flight captured in audio. Finally, Mackenzie stops. His breathing is ragged, punctuated by sobs. He speaks directly into the recorder, his voice breaking. "It took Walsh, just grabbed him and he was gone, lifted right off the ground. I shot it, I hit it, I know I did, but it didn't even slow down. It looked at me. God help me. It looked at me with Tommy's face. It had Tommy's face." The recording continues for another hour. Mackenzie makes it back to base camp, where he finds the other 4 team members huddled in the main shelter. Rifles out, faces pale. They'd heard the screaming too, though they were over 2 miles away. The audio captures their shocked conversation, the disbelief when Mackenzie tells them what happened, the growing horror as they realize Walsh is gone. They try to raise help on their radio, but get only static. One of the surveyors suggests going back to look for Walsh. Mackenzie's response is immediate and forceful. "Nobody leaves this camp until the helicopter comes. We wait. We stay together. That's an order." They spent the next 18 hours in that shelter, and the audio recorder kept running. What it captured during those hours is the reason the Canadian government tried to bury this case. Throughout the night, they heard sounds outside the shelter. Footsteps crunching in snow, circling the building, scratching on the walls, long, slow scrapes that would pause, then resume from a different side of the structure. But worst were the voices. Each member of the team heard the voices of people they knew, people calling their names from just outside the shelter walls. Mackenzie's dead wife asking him to let her in from the cold. One surveyor's voice being mimicked, calling for help from the darkness, even though he sat inside with the others. Walsh's voice pleading, begging them to open the door, saying he was hurt and needed help. They didn't open that door. Mackenzie kept them together through sheer force of will, making them talk to each other, confirm everyone was accounted for, ignore what they heard outside, no matter how convincing it sounded. When dawn finally came, the sound stopped. The helicopter arrived at 8 in the morning to find all 5 survivors alive, but profoundly changed. The search for Thomas Walsh lasted 3 days and involved tracker dogs, helicopter overflights, and ground teams covering hundreds of square miles. They found his snowshoes approximately 300 yards from where the incident occurred, not removed, torn apart as if ripped from his feet with such force the bindings shattered. They found scraps of his parka scattered over a quarter-mile area, the fabric shredded into strips, and they found blood, frozen droplets forming a trail that led deep into the forest before ending at the base of a massive pine tree. The blood trail didn't stop because whoever followed it gave up. It stopped because it went vertical, up the trunk of that tree, 40 feet high, where they found Walsh's survey kit embedded in the bark. Just the kit, nothing else. No body was ever recovered. The official cause of Walsh's disappearance was listed as animal attack, probably a bear or pack of wolves. The fact that it was February when bears hibernate and wolves don't attack adult humans, was conveniently ignored. The fact that no predator drags its prey 40 feet up a tree was never addressed. The recording was classified. The team members were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, and Robert Mackenzie never worked in forestry again. He died in 1993, and at his funeral, his daughter shared that he'd spent the last 16 years of his life sleeping with lights on, unable to tolerate silence, jumping at every unexpected sound. Whatever he saw in those Saskatchewan woods, it never let him go. Listen closely to this next part, because this is where the pattern becomes undeniable. When researchers finally got access to that classified recording in 2015, they noticed something in the audio that the original investigators had missed. During those 18 hours in the shelter, while the team heard voices and footsteps outside, there were other sounds underneath, subliminal, almost ultrasonic, but there when you filter the audio properly. A kind of low frequency pulse, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat but far too slow. One beat every 7 seconds. Sound engineers who analyzed it said the frequency was specifically calibrated to induce anxiety in humans, triggering the same fear response as a predator's approach. But here's what makes it impossible to dismiss as natural phenomenon. That exact same frequency appears in our next encounter, recorded independently 3 decades later on completely different equipment thousands of miles away. Our third encounter brings us to the winter of 2007, to the forests of northern Maine, where a group of college students decided to document their winter camping trip for a class project. What started as a simple outdoor recreation assignment became something that would end with 2 students hospitalized for severe psychological trauma and footage that university officials tried desperately to suppress. The group consisted of 8 students from the University of Maine, all enrolled in an outdoor education program. They'd planned a 5-day winter camping expedition in the Allagash Wilderness, a remote region known for its pristine forests and complete isolation from human development. The area has its own dark history. It's been the site of multiple disappearances over the decades, enough that locals refer to certain sections of the wilderness as dead zones, places where compasses spin uselessly and electronics fail without explanation. The students were well prepared, or so they thought. They had proper cold weather gear, experienced guides, GPS units, satellite phones, and most importantly, for our story, 3 video cameras to document their experience. The group included Amanda Reeves, a senior studying environmental science, who would later become the primary witness in what investigators called the Allagash incident. Her testimony, combined with the recovered footage, paints a picture of an encounter that defies conventional explanation. The first 3 days proceeded normally. The footage from that period shows typical camping activities: students setting up tents, cooking meals over camp stoves, hiking through snow-laden forests. There's laughter, the easy camaraderie of young people on an adventure. Amanda's narration is enthusiastic, pointing out wildlife tracks, discussing forest ecology, everything you'd expect from an outdoor education project. Day 4 is when the footage changes. It's subtle at first. Amanda's voice becomes less animated, more subdued. Several students complain of headaches, a persistent pressure behind their eyes that aspirin doesn't touch. One student, Marcus Chen, mentions feeling watched, that persistent crawling sensation on the back of the neck that makes you want to constantly look over your shoulder. By afternoon, the group's mood has shifted noticeably. The easy jokes have stopped. People are snapping at each other, tensions rising for no apparent reason. One of their guides, a man named Tom Whitmore, who'd been leading trips in the Allagash for 15 years, suggested they break camp early and head back. He wouldn't explain why on camera, but his expression shows someone who recognizes danger even if he can't articulate what it is. They didn't leave early. The decision would haunt the survivors. That night, around 10 o'clock, Amanda was doing a final video log entry outside her tent when she heard something moving in the forest beyond their camp. The footage shows her turning the camera toward the sound. the night vision mode casting everything in eerie green light. At first, there's nothing visible except trees and snow. Then something moves between the pines, too far away to make out clearly, but visible enough to see it's large and moving on two legs. Amanda's breathing accelerates on the audio. She calls out, asking if anyone else is awake, if someone's wandering around outside camp. No response. The figure moves closer, weaving between trees with a strange gliding motion. When it's about 50 yards away, it stops. Even in the grainy night vision footage, you can see the basic shape. Impossibly tall, rail thin, with something protruding from the head region that could be antlers or branches, except branches don't move independently. The creature tilts its head, and Amanda gasps. The camera shakes as her hands tremble, but she keeps filming. For almost 30 seconds, nothing happens. The creature stands there, motionless except for that head tilt, studying her. Then it opens its mouth. What comes out is captured perfectly on the audio, and it's a sound that doesn't belong to any earthly animal. It starts as a low moan, rising in pitch and volume, until it becomes a shriek that makes Amanda drop the camera. The footage shows snow and darkness for a moment, spinning wildly, then focuses on nothing as she runs. You can hear her screaming, hear the zipper of a tent, voices shouting in confusion and fear. The camera keeps recording from where it fell, and for the next 7 minutes, it captures something extraordinary and terrifying. Multiple figures emerge from the tree line. They move into camp from different directions, and the night vision picks up their shapes clearly enough to see they're not bears, not moose, not any animal that should exist. They're humanoid but wrong. Their proportions distorted, limbs too long, and joints bending at angles that make your eyes hurt to track. They move around the camp in a pattern, circling, and you can hear the students inside their tents, crying, praying, some screaming. One tent shakes violently, as if something is testing its structure, seeing if the fabric will give. Then a voice comes from one of the creatures, and it's speaking English. The words are slurred, stretched out, but understandable. "Come out! So hungry! Please come out!" It uses the voice of one of the students, a perfect mimicry of Marcus Chen's voice, even though Marcus is accounted for inside a tent, whimpering in terror. The circling continues for what feels like hours, but the timestamp shows is only 11 minutes. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the creatures withdraw. They move back toward the tree line, and the last one visible on camera stops turns back toward where the camera lies in the snow and stares directly at it. For 3 full seconds, its face fills the frame. The night vision can't capture fine detail, but what's visible is enough. Sunken eyes that reflect light like an animal's, a mouth stretched too wide, skin that seems to hang loose on the skull beneath. Then it's gone, and the forest is empty again. The camera kept recording until the battery died 2 hours later, capturing nothing but an empty campsite and the sound of students sobbing inside their tents. Nobody slept that night. Nobody left their tents until full daylight. And even then, they moved as a group, huddled together, speaking in whispers. The guides made the decision to evacuate immediately. They abandoned most of their gear, taking only essentials, and began the forced march back to civilization. It took them 8 hours of hard hiking to reach the nearest ranger station. And by the time they arrived, 2 students were catatonic, unresponsive to external stimuli, eyes fixed on nothing. Amanda was lucid enough to hand over the video cameras and give a preliminary statement, but she kept repeating one phrase. They were so hungry. You could feel how hungry they were. The Maine Forest Service launched an investigation, mostly as a formality. They reviewed the footage, interviewed the students and guides, and sent a recovery team to retrieve the abandoned equipment. What that team found at the campsite added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable event. The camp showed signs of visitation. Tents were untouched, but items left outside had been moved, rearranged into patterns. Food bags were opened but not eaten, the contents scattered in circles around the perimeter. And in the snow surrounding the camp, there were tracks. Dozens of tracks, maybe hundreds, all roughly humanoid but with variations in size and shape. Some were small, child-sized, others were massive, leaving impressions nearly 2 feet long. The tracks circled the camp in overlapping patterns, weaving in and out, creating a maze of prints that seemed to have no beginning or end. Forensic analysis of the prints showed something that shouldn't be possible. The depth and weight distribution indicated the creatures making these tracks weighed next to nothing, as if they were hollow or made of material far less dense than flesh and bone. Yet the force required to leave impressions that deep suggested immense weight. The physics didn't work. It was as if the laws of nature had bent around whatever made these tracks. But the detail that sealed the investigation and led to the footage being classified was what they found in the center of the camp. Right where the fire pit had been, there was now a hole in the ground. Not dug, not excavated. The earth had opened up somehow, leaving a perfectly circular shaft descending straight down into the frozen ground. The recovery team lowered a camera on a cable, and the shaft went down 40 feet before ending in a small chamber. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and covered in scratch marks that formed patterns, symbols perhaps, though no one could identify them as belonging to any known language or cultural tradition. The temperature in that chamber measured 15 degrees colder than the surrounding environment, and the air samples showed elevated levels of methane and carbon monoxide, gases that shouldn't be present in a sealed underground space. The video footage was officially classified by the Maine State Police in cooperation with federal authorities. The students were required to sign non-disclosure agreements, though several violated those agreements years later, speaking to paranormal researchers and podcasters. Amanda Reeves transferred to a different university, finished her degree, and moved to Arizona, where she still lives today. She refuses to go into any forested area, won't even walk through city parks if there are too many trees. In interviews, she's described an overwhelming sensation she experienced that night, one that none of the others reported. She said she could feel the hunger radiating from those creatures, a desperate, all-consuming need that was so intense it became a physical pressure in the air. They weren't evil, she once said in an interview. They were starving. Whatever they were, whatever made them that way, they were trapped in a state of eternal hunger. And I got the sense that they weren't just hungry for food, they were hungry for everything. Warmth, life, humanity. They wanted what they'd lost. The Allagash footage has circulated online in various forms, usually dismissed as a hoax or creative fiction. But the original high-resolution files tell a different story. Digital forensics experts have examined the footage frame by frame, looking for signs of manipulation, CGI, costume work, anything that would indicate fabrication. The consensus among those who've seriously studied the material is unsettling. If it's fake, it's done with technology and techniques that didn't exist in 2007. The way the creatures move, the way they interact with light and shadow, the reflective quality of their eyes, all of it suggests something that was genuinely captured on camera, not created in post-production. And there's that sound again, the same low-frequency pulse that appeared in the Saskatchewan recording. It's there in the Allagash footage too, hidden beneath the audible sounds, that same 7-second rhythm. 3 encounters, separated by decades and thousands of miles, all containing the same acoustic signature. Keep that in mind as we move to our 4th encounter, because this is where the connections become impossible to ignore. This next case involves a family, and what happened to them over the course of a single winter in northern Michigan would end with a house burned to the ground, and questions that authorities still can't answer. The detail everyone overlooks is that the family tried to warn people. They reached out for help repeatedly, filed police reports, contacted wildlife services, even hired paranormal investigators, but nobody believed them until it was too late. Nobody wanted to accept what they were saying, because accepting it would mean acknowledging that something is out there in those northern forests, something that watches and waits and hunts in ways we don't understand. The Morrison family moved to their property outside Marquette, Michigan in November of 2011. James and Sarah Morrison along with their 2 children, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Lucas, had purchased 40 acres of forested land with a modest 2-story house set back nearly a mile from the nearest road. It was their dream property, the kind of isolation they had always wanted. A place where their children could experience nature without the constant noise and distraction of modern suburban life. The house had been empty for 3 years before they bought it, the previous owners having abandoned it after only 6 months of residence. The real estate agent mentioned this casually, attributing it to financial difficulties. What she didn't mention was that those previous owners had filed 17 police reports in those 6 months, all describing the same thing. Something in the woods that watched their house at night. The Morrisons settled in quickly. James worked remotely as a software developer. Sarah homeschooled the children, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. They documented their new life extensively, posting photos and videos to social media, sharing their adventure with friends and family back in Ohio. Those early posts show a happy family, children playing in the snow, parents clearing trails through the forest, the kind of wholesome content that makes people envious. But if you look closely at the backgrounds of those photos, you can sometimes see things that don't quite fit. Shadows between trees that seem too tall and narrow to be natural. Branches arranged in patterns that look almost deliberate. And in one photo, taken by James of Sarah, and the kids building a snowman, there's something in the tree line behind them. Most people never notice it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. A figure, tall and skeletal, partially obscured by pine branches, watching the family. The first incident that James documented in his journal, which would later be entered as evidence, occurred on December 3rd. He woke at 3 in the morning to a sound he initially thought was wind chimes, except they didn't own wind chimes. The sound was coming from outside, a melodic tinkling that seemed to move around the perimeter of the house. He got up, looked out the bedroom window, and saw nothing. The sound continued for another 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. He went back to bed, dismissing it as some odd acoustic phenomenon, wind moving through the trees in just the right way to create that sound. But the next morning, he found something that made him reconsider. Hanging from the branches of the large pine tree nearest their house were dozens of small bones, strung together with what looked like sinew or dried plant fiber. The bones were from small animals, mice and voles mostly, cleaned completely of flesh and arranged in a spiral pattern that descended from a high branch nearly 20 feet up. Sarah wanted to call the police immediately. James talked her out of it, suggesting it was probably just local teenagers trying to scare the new residents, some kind of hazing ritual. He took the bone chimes down and burned them in their wood stove. That night, the sound returned, even though the bones were ash, and this time, there was knocking. Not on the door or windows, but on the walls of the house itself, moving from room to room as if something was circling the structure, tapping as it went. The children heard it too. Emma came into her parents' room, terrified, saying something was outside her window. When James checked, he found handprints on the glass. Not regular handprints. These were elongated, the fingers far too long, pressed against the outside of the second-story window with enough force to leave oily residue on the glass. Whatever left those prints had reached a window 15 feet off the ground. This is when James started keeping detailed records. His journal entries from December 2011 paint a picture of a family under siege from something they couldn't understand or fight. December 5th. More knocking tonight. Sarah is barely sleeping. Found our woodpile rearranged into a circular pattern. Logs stacked in ways that should be impossible. Balancing on end. Called sheriff. Deputy came out, looked around, suggested bears. Bears don't stack wood. December 7th. Emma says she saw someone in the woods watching the house during her lessons today. Described it as very tall and skinny, like a person made of sticks. I checked, found tracks in the snow leading right up to the tree line where she said she saw it. Tracks are humanoid but wrong. Too long, too narrow. Sheriff won't come back out. December 10th is when the voice mimicry started. Sarah heard Lucas calling for help from the woods behind their house. She ran outside without thinking, following his voice deeper into the trees, calling his name. She was 100 yards into the forest before she realized Lucas was inside the house, sitting at the kitchen table working on a math lesson. The voice she'd been following went silent the moment she stopped running. She turned around to find her way back and discovered she couldn't see the house anymore, even though she'd only gone a short distance. The forest seemed denser somehow, the trees closer together than they should be. She said later that she felt turned around, disoriented in a way that made no sense given how familiar she was with their property. She was lost in the woods behind her own house for 2 hours, wandering in circles, until she finally broke through to the clearing and saw their home. James found her standing at the edge of the tree line, hypothermic and incoherent, unable to explain how she'd gotten so lost in such a small area. That incident convinced James they needed help. He reached out to the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, to Wildlife Control Services, to anyone who might take their situation seriously. Most dismissed him outright. One DNR officer suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, that the family was experiencing shared hallucinations from a faulty furnace. James had the furnace inspected. It was fine. He installed carbon monoxide detectors throughout the house. They never went off. In desperation, he contacted a paranormal investigation team from Detroit, a group that had some credibility in the field. They agreed to visit the property and conduct a formal investigation. That investigation was scheduled for December 20th. It never happened. On December 17th, 3 days before the investigators were supposed to arrive, Lucas disappeared. It was 4 in the afternoon, still light outside. He'd been playing in the living room while Sarah prepared dinner. She stepped into the kitchen for no more than 5 minutes. When she came back, Lucas was gone. The front door stood open, letting in cold air and snow. They found his footprints leading from the porch into the woods, small boot prints in fresh snow. But those weren't the only prints. Walking alongside Lucas's trail were larger tracks, the same elongated humanoid prints they'd been finding for weeks. The tracks suggested that something had walked up to the house, waited by the door, then walked away with Lucas, following beside it willingly. James called 911. The response was immediate and massive. Local police, state police, search and rescue teams, volunteers from surrounding communities, everyone mobilized to find a missing 7-year-old boy in the middle of winter. The search continued for 4 days, covering hundreds of acres of forest. Dogs lost the scent repeatedly, handlers reporting that their animals seemed confused or frightened, refusing to track beyond certain points. Thermal imaging from helicopters picked up nothing. It was as if Lucas had simply vanished. On the 4th day of the search, December 21st, Emma started screaming in her bedroom. When James and Sarah ran upstairs, they found her standing at the window, pointing at the woods. She said she saw Lucas. He was standing between the trees at the edge of the clearing, just standing there, watching the house. James ran outside, calling Lucas's name, running toward where Emma said she'd seen him. He found nothing. No tracks, no signs anyone had been there. But when he turned back toward the house, he saw them. Dozens of figures standing among the trees, all around the property, forming a loose circle around the Morrison home. They were only visible for a moment, dark shapes that seemed to melt into the shadows when he tried to focus on them directly. But he could feel their presence, feel the weight of their attention. That's when he understood. Whatever these things were, they weren't trying to drive the family away. They were keeping them there. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The harassment, the stalking, the mimicry, all of it was designed to keep the family isolated, frightened, trapped on this property, far from help. And now they had Lucas. James Morrison made a decision that night that would end with him facing criminal charges. He gathered everything flammable in the house, doused the interior with gasoline from their generator supply, took his wife and daughter, and burned their home to the ground. The fire was visible for miles, bringing fire departments from 3 different counties. By the time the trucks arrived, the house was fully engulfed, flames reaching 50 feet into the winter sky. James stood with Sarah and Emma in the driveway, watching it burn, and he told the first firefighters who approached exactly what he'd done and why. He said the house was contaminated, that something evil lived in the woods around it, that burning the house was the only way to break whatever connection existed between the property and those things in the forest. The investigation that followed was extensive. James was charged with arson and reckless endangerment. Sarah was hospitalized for a psychological evaluation. Emma was placed temporarily with child services. But during the investigation, something strange emerged. When crews began clearing the burned remains of the house, they found a basement that didn't appear on any of the property blueprints. A crawl space beneath the foundation that the Morrisons hadn't known existed. And in that crawl space, they found bones. Hundreds of bones from dozens of animals. And forensic analysis would later confirm, from at least 3 human individuals. The bones were arranged in patterns on the dirt floor. Spirals and symbols that matched the scratch marks found in the chamber beneath the Allagash campsite. The 3 human skeletons were eventually identified through dental records. They were the previous owners of the property, the family, who'd filed all those police reports before supposedly moving away. They'd never left. Carbon dating of material found with the remains suggested some of the animal bones were over a century old. James Morrison was ultimately cleared of charges after this discovery, though he spent 8 months in legal limbo. Lucas was never found. The search officially ended after 6 months, but James never stopped looking. He divorced Sarah 2 years later, their marriage unable to survive the loss and trauma. Emma grew up and moved as far from Michigan as possible, settling in Southern California where, she once said in a therapy session, the lack of winter and absence of deep forests makes her feel safe. James still lives in Marquette, though not on that property. The land was seized by the state and declared a wildlife preservation area, off limits to public access. Officially, this was due to environmental concerns. Unofficially, the local police had received too many reports from people who'd wandered onto the property. Reports of voices calling to them from the woods, of figures watching from the tree line, of an overwhelming feeling of being hunted. The Morrison case file contains one final detail that connects it to all the previous encounters. When forensic teams analyzed the symbols carved into the bones found in the crawl space, they brought in experts in ancient languages and indigenous writing systems. One researcher, a specialist in Algonquian languages, recognized some of the patterns. They were warnings, messages carved by different hands over many years. The translations were fragmentary, incomplete, but the meaning was clear. They hunger. The winter brings them. Feed the cold or become the cold. The researcher noted in her report that similar warnings appear in Cree and Ojibwe oral traditions, stories about spirits that embody starvation and cold, entities that transform humans who give in to desperate hunger during harsh winters. The Wendigo isn't just a creature, according to these traditions. It's a state of being, a transformation that occurs when survival instinct crosses a line into something darker. Which brings us to our 5th and final encounter, the most recent case, and perhaps the most disturbing, because it's still ongoing. What happened next changes everything you thought you knew. This encounter didn't take place in remote wilderness or isolated forest property. It happened in a town, among people, in a location where something like this shouldn't be possible. And unlike the previous cases, this one was witnessed by over 50 people simultaneously, documented from multiple angles, investigated by federal authorities, and still has no official explanation. The incident occurred in the small town of Eerie, Minnesota, population 3,500, during the annual Winter Festival on January 26, 2022. The Eerie Winter Festival is a tradition going back decades, a celebration that brings the community together. During the darkest, coldest part of the year, there's a parade, ice sculptures, outdoor markets, all the typical small-town festivities. The festival takes place on Main Street, which runs through the heart of the downtown area. Businesses decorate, vendors set up booths, families come out despite temperatures that regularly hover around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. It's wholesome, community-oriented, the kind of event that defines small-town America. On January 26, 2022, the festival was in full swing. Roughly 800 people were gathered along Main Street, enjoying the activities, when something impossible walked out of the woods at the north end of town. Multiple witnesses saw it emerge from the tree line that borders the edge of the developed area. Their descriptions are remarkably consistent, which is unusual in mass sighting events where panic and confusion typically lead to wildly varying accounts. This thing stood between 9 and 10 feet tall, skeletal thin, with grayish white skin that seemed to steam in the cold air. Its limbs were disproportionately long, and it moved with a lurching gait that witnesses described as both awkward and terrifyingly fast. The head was elongated, the face gaunt with sunken eyes, and a mouth that stretched too wide. Several witnesses mentioned antlers or horn-like protrusions from the skull, though others said it was just the creature's emaciated head that created that impression. What everyone agreed on was the smell. Even in the frigid outdoor air, the stench of decay preceded the creature, so powerful that people 50 feet away reported gagging. The creature walked down Main Street, not running, not attacking, simply walking down the center of the road through the festival crowd. People scattered, screaming, pulling children out of its path. Some witnesses reported that it seemed confused, turning its head to look at the fleeing people with what appeared to be curiosity rather than aggression. It made sounds, a low clicking or rasping noise that multiple recordings captured. When analyzed later, audio experts said the vocalizations had a structure to them, almost like language, but not matching any known linguistic pattern. The creature continued down Main Street for approximately 3 blocks, maybe 400 yards, before turning east and walking back into the woods. From emergence to disappearance, the entire event lasted less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes changed Ellie forever. The aftermath was chaos. Emergency services were overwhelmed with calls. The sheriff's department responded immediately, but by the time deputies reached the woods where the creature had disappeared, there was nothing to find. No tracks, no trace, nothing. Within hours, state police arrived. By evening, federal agents were on scene. The official investigation was assigned to a joint task force that included FBI, CDC, and branches of Homeland Security that most people don't even know exist. Witnesses were interviewed extensively, many subjected to multiple rounds of questioning that felt more like interrogation. The dozens of videos and photos taken during the incident were confiscated as evidence. News coverage was minimal and quickly suppressed. Within a week, the official narrative had solidified: mass hallucination caused by contaminated food or water at the festival. The fact that no contamination was ever found didn't seem to matter, but you can't confiscate every recording, can't interview every witness thoroughly enough to ensure silence. Videos leaked online, testimony spread through social media, and the more authorities tried to suppress the story, the more attention it received. Independent researchers descended on Ely, interviewing locals, analyzing the footage, trying to piece together what really happened. What they discovered was that the January 26th sighting wasn't isolated. People in Ely had been seeing things for months before the festival. Strange figures in the woods, tracks that appeared overnight in the snow. Livestock killed in ways that didn't match any known predator. A woman named Margaret Chen, who'd lived in Ely her entire 73 years, told researchers that what walked down Main Street that day was something the old-timers had always known was out there. The Wendigo, the winter cannibal, the hunger that walks. Margaret shared something else, a piece of local history that had never been widely known. In the winter of 1924, during one of the worst blizzards in Minnesota history, a group of miners became trapped in the wilderness outside Ely. They were cut off from town for 3 weeks, stranded in a small cabin with limited supplies. When rescuers finally reached them, they found only 2 survivors out of the original 9 men. The survivors were incoherent, violent, and dangerously emaciated, despite evidence suggesting they'd had access to food. The bodies of the 7 dead men were never found, though the cabin showed signs of significant struggle. The 2 survivors were institutionalized and died within months, never regaining their sanity. Margaret said her grandfather had been part of the rescue team. He'd found something in that cabin that he never spoke about publicly, but that haunted him until his death. Carved into the wooden walls, repeated hundreds of times in different hands, was a single word: hungry. The researchers investigating the Eerie incident discovered something else, something that connects all 5 encounters we've discussed. Each event occurred during periods of extreme cold, when temperatures dropped below -20 Fahrenheit for extended periods. Each took place in locations with documented histories of harsh winters and incidents of isolation. And in each case, there were previous disappearances or unexplained deaths in the same general area, going back decades or even centuries. The pattern suggests something that's been present in these northern forests for a very long time, something that emerges during the deepest cold, drawn by isolation and desperation. The Algonquian peoples who first inhabited these regions understood this. Their stories about the Wendigo weren't meant to be simple monster tales. They were warnings about what happens when you let hunger, cold, and isolation consume you, when you cross certain lines that shouldn't be crossed. Modern science has struggled to explain these encounters. The mainstream explanation remains mass hallucination, misidentification of known animals, or outright hoaxes, but the evidence is harder to dismiss when you look at it collectively. The consistent descriptions across time and distance, the physical evidence that doesn't match known animals or humans, the acoustic signatures that appear in multiple independent recordings, the psychological and physiological effects on witnesses. Something is out there in those northern forests, whether it's an unknown species, a surviving population of some prehistoric hominid, or something that doesn't fit into our current understanding of biology at all. The encounters continue to accumulate. The most unsettling aspect of these cases is how the phenomenon seems to be adapting, becoming bolder. The early encounters from the 1970s and 80s involved isolated individuals or small groups in deep wilderness. By the 2000s, encounters were happening closer to civilization, on private property, near small communities. The Eerie incident represented a threshold crossing, something walking into a populated area in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses. Researchers who track these reports have noticed an acceleration pattern. Sightings that were once separated by years now occur months apart. The geographical range is expanding, with reports coming from regions that historically had no Wendigo traditions. Something has changed, though no one can say exactly what or why. There are theories, of course: climate change causing shifts in animal behavior and habitat ranges, some unknown apex predator being pushed into contact with humans as wilderness shrinks, a social contagion effect where increased media coverage leads to more reports and misidentifications. But these theories don't account for the specific details, the consistent patterns, the physical evidence that defies easy categorization. They don't explain the bones arranged in symbols beneath the Morrison house, or the impossible weight distribution in the Allagash tracks, or the acoustic signatures that appear across decades and technologies. They don't explain why witnesses consistently describe the same overwhelming sensation of hunger radiating from these entities, or why encounters cluster around the coldest periods of winter, or why the phenomenon seems specifically drawn to isolation and desperation. The Indigenous traditions offer a different framework for understanding. The Wendigo in these stories isn't just a creature to be studied or avoided. It's a representation of a fundamental aspect of the world. The darkness that emerges when compassion fails, when survival instinct overwhelms humanity, when hunger becomes all-consuming. Every culture that survived in harsh climates has similar stories, similar warnings. They're teaching tales about maintaining community and humanity, even when conditions make it easier to abandon both. The transformation into a Wendigo in traditional stories begins with a choice, the decision to prioritize individual survival over communal good, to cross the line into cannibalism or betrayal. Once that line is crossed, the stories say the transformation is irreversible. The person becomes something else, something driven by insatiable hunger that can never be satisfied, no matter how much it consumes. What if these stories aren't metaphors? What if they're documentation of something real, passed down through generations, because the threat remains constant? The people who lived in these regions for thousands of years before European contact understood their environment in ways we're still struggling to match. They knew which plants were edible, how to read weather patterns, where to find resources during the hardest seasons. They also knew there were things in the deep forest that were best avoided, places you didn't go during certain times, protocols to follow when winter lasted too long and supplies ran short. That knowledge was survival critical, encoded in stories and traditions that kept communities safe. We've largely lost that knowledge, dismissed it as superstition or primitive belief. But the things those stories warned about haven't disappeared just because we stopped believing in them. The 5 encounters we've examined represent a tiny fraction of the reports filed every year. Most never receive serious investigation. Many are never reported at all because witnesses fear ridicule or don't know who to tell. The incidents that do get documented often end up classified, buried in files that require specific clearances to access, locked away under the rationale of preventing public panic or protecting ongoing investigations that never seem to conclude. But the information leaks out, piece by piece, through leaked documents, testimony from witnesses who refuse to stay silent, researchers who compile data from dozens of sources to create a larger picture. That picture is troubling. Something is sharing these northern forests with us, something that intersects with human experience in traumatic ways, something that our current frameworks can't adequately explain or address. The question isn't whether the Wendigo exists in some literal sense. The question is what these encounters represent, what they tell us about the boundaries of our understanding, the limits of our control over the environment we inhabit. Every person who's had a direct encounter comes away changed, marked by the experience in ways that last years or lifetimes. Mark Sullivan, from the Minnesota incident, never hunted again, spent his remaining years working with urban youth programs, far from forests and wilderness. Amanda Reeves from Allagash can't tolerate being around trees, lives in the desert Southwest where the landscape is open and sight lines are long. James Morrison still searches for his son, though he knows rationally that Lucas is gone, transformed or consumed by whatever took him into those Michigan woods. These aren't people prone to hysteria or prone to believing in monsters. They're ordinary individuals who encountered something extraordinary and came back with their lives fundamentally altered. As climate patterns shift and human populations push further into previously wild areas, these encounters are likely to increase. The boundaries between human habitation and deep wilderness are blurring. Development extends into regions that were once buffer zones, places where things that belonged to the wild had room to exist without intersecting with our world. As those buffers disappear, contact becomes inevitable, and if the pattern of escalation continues, if entities like the Wendigo are indeed becoming bolder and more willing to enter populated areas, we may be approaching a threshold where these encounters can no longer be suppressed or dismissed. What happens then is anyone's guess. Do we finally mount serious scientific investigations, approaching the phenomenon with the resources and rigor it deserves? Do we revive traditional knowledge, consulting with Indigenous communities who never stopped believing and who may have protocols for coexistence? Or do we continue with denial and suppression until an encounter occurs that's too large, too public, too undeniable to bury? The truth is, Breakcoit, we don't know what the Wendigo is. We have theories, traditions, scattered evidence, and traumatized witnesses. What we do know is that something is out there in the cold northern forests, something that's been there for a very long time, something that our ancestors knew enough to fear and respect. Whether it's a cryptid species unknown to science, a psychological phenomenon that manifests physical effects, an interdimensional entity, or something that combines the elements of all these explanations, it deserves serious attention. The 5 encounters documented here represent real events, real people, real trauma. They're not entertainment, not folklore, to be casually consumed and dismissed. They're warnings, just as the original Wendigo stories were warnings. Pay attention to what they're telling us. Respect the boundaries they mark. Understand that there are still things in this world that we don't fully comprehend. Things that exist whether we believe in them or not. If you find yourself in the northern forest during the deepest part of winter, remember what you've heard here. If you smell decay on air that should be too cold to carry scent, if you feel the temperature drop suddenly and without explanation, if you hear voices calling from the darkness using words they shouldn't know, don't investigate. Don't follow. Don't assume you're safe because you don't believe. The Wendigo doesn't require your belief to exist. It requires only hunger, cold, and the darkness that falls when compassion fails. And it's still out there, waiting in the frozen forests, patient and hungry, and infinitely capable of transforming those who underestimate what lurks beyond the firelight. Stay safe, stay together, and never venture into the winter wilderness alone. Some hungers can never be satisfied, and some transformations can never be undone.